St. Jude's Advanced Trauma Center was a cathedral of modern medicine, a place where the air always smelled of harsh antiseptic and the floors gleamed like polished ice. It was a hospital built for the elite, staffed by the elite, and practically pulsing with the bloated egos of its top-tier surgeons. And then there was Elias Thorne. At 42 years old, Elias was the oldest rookie charge nurse on the floor. He was a quiet, unassuming man with broad shoulders, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes the color of a winter sky that seemed to take in everything while giving nothing away. To the rest of the staff, he was just a glorified janitor in light blue scrubs, a man who had supposedly found himself late in life after bouncing around vague, unimportant government contracting jobs. He didn't gossip. He didn't complain, and he certainly never fought back when the doctors used him as their personal punching bag, which made him the perfect target for Dr. Vance Sterling. Dr. Sterling was 34, wore custom-tailored designer scrubs, and possessed a jawline as sharp as his legendary God complex. He was the chief resident of trauma, a man who had never failed a test, never lost a wealthy patient, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone in the room of his own brilliance. "Thorne?" Sterling's voice cracked like a whip across the bustling nurses' station. Elias, who was meticulously restocking a crash cart with steady, methodical hands, paused. He turned slowly, his face a perfectly blank mask. "Yes, Dr. Sterling." Sterling strutted forward, trailed by a gaggle of wide-eyed, sycophantic medical students. He stopped just inches from Elias, intentionally invading the old man's personal space. With a careless wave of his hand, Sterling knocked over a stainless steel tray Elias had just sterilized. Suture kits, bandages, and heavy clamps clattered loudly across the pristine tile floor. "Look at this mess," Sterling sneered, crossing his arms. He didn't even glance at the fallen tools. His eyes were locked on Elias, brimming with cruel amusement. "You know, Thorne, I was reviewing the scheduling roster this morning. It truly baffles me how someone your age is still fetching my coffee and wiping down gurneys. What did you do with the first 2 decades of your life? Sit on a couch?" A few of the medical students snickered. Head nurse Beatrice, a harsh woman who practically worshipped the ground Sterling walked on, marched over, her lips pursed in disdain. "Dr. Sterling is speaking to you, Elias. Pick those up immediately. Your lack of situational awareness is a liability to this hospital. If you can't handle the basic remedial tasks of a floor nurse without getting in the way of our top surgeons, I will have you transferred to the geriatric ward by Friday." Elias looked at the scattered medical supplies. A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a fraction of a second, the sterile white lights of the hospital faded. In his mind, he smelled cordite, burning diesel, and the metallic tang of blood in the Afghan dirt. He felt the phantom weight of a 60-pound med kit strapped to his chest, the deafening roar of a Black Hawk helicopter rotor, and the desperate, pleading eyes of men whose lives depended on his hands. Men who called him a legend. Men who knew him by a name that didn't exist on any public record. But Elias pushed the memory down, locking it away behind a megal steel door. He had promised himself a quiet life. No more war, no more blood. Without a single word, Elias slowly knelt to the floor. He picked up the dropped suture kit with a hand that didn't possess even a microscopic tremor. He rose to his feet, placed the tray back on the cart, and looked Dr. Sterling dead in the eye. "My apologies, doctor," he said, his voice quiet, deep, and unnervingly calm. "I will be more careful to stay out of your way." Sterling scoffed, rolling his eyes as he turned back to his students. "Pathetic," he muttered loudly. "The man has 0 spine." "All right, residents, today we're going to discuss actual medicine, not whatever it is Thorne does with his time." Elias simply turned back to his cart, taking a slow, measured breath. He could endure the insults. He could endure the disrespect. It was the price he was willing to pay for peace. But that peace was about to shatter. Suddenly, the red emergency phone on the nurse's station, the direct, encrypted line connected to the city's central disaster dispatch, began to ring. It wasn't the standard trauma tone. It was a piercing, continuous alarm that only sounded for catastrophic, mass casualty events. Head nurse Beatrice snatched the receiver. "St. Jude's trauma, this is—" She stopped. All the color instantly drained from her face. Her hand began to shake violently against the plastic phone. "How far out?" she whispered, her voice cracking in pure terror. "Oh my God! Wait, military? We aren't equipped for—" Before she could finish, the heavy double mechanical doors of the emergency bay violently blew open, and the deafening wail of approaching sirens drowned out the hospital floor. The heavy double doors of St. Jude's Advanced Trauma Center didn't just open, they were violently shoved apart by sheer, desperate force. The deafening wail of sirens outside was immediately eclipsed by the chaotic shouts of men trained for war, now panicked in the face of death. Instead of standard paramedics, 4 heavily armed men in shattered, dust-caked tactical gear swarmed into the pristine triage bay. They were dragging 2 military-grade field litters. The sterile scent of the hospital was instantly overpowered by the harsh, acrid smell of burned Kevlar, diesel fuel, and copper. "We need a trauma surgeon, now!" bellowed a soldier whose face was half covered in soot, his combat rifle slung hastily across his back. "We have a critical alpha-level VIP down. I need a doctor." Total pandemonium erupted. Nurses scattered like startled birds. The medical students who had been laughing at Dr. Sterling's cruel jokes moments ago now shrank back against the walls, terrified of the loud voices and the aggressive posture of the men. Dr. Vance Sterling, however, saw an opportunity. Smoothing the front of his designer scrubs, he strode forward with unearned authority, holding up a hand as if he were directing traffic. "All right, lower your voices and stand down, gentlemen," Sterling commanded, his tone dripping with textbook condescension. "You are in a civilian hospital now. I am Dr. Sterling, the chief resident of trauma. I give the orders here." The lead soldier grabbed Sterling by the shoulder, his grip like a vice. "Listen to me, doctor. The captain took the brunt of an IED blast overpressure. We've got a secondary casualty with a shredded brachial artery, but the captain is fading fast. He needs an operating room 5 minutes ago." Sterling violently brushed the soldier's hand away, highly offended. "Do not touch me, and do not tell me how to triage my emergency room." Sterling turned his attention to the 2 litters. On the first lay a young corporal, screaming in agony, clutching a heavily bandaged arm that was seeping crimson. On the second litter lay the captain. The older man was eerily silent, his face the color of wet ash. His tactical vest had been blown open, but externally there were only a few superficial lacerations. To a seasoned combat medic, the silence was a deafening alarm. To a textbook civilian doctor fueled by ego, the screaming man was the obvious priority. "Beatrice," Sterling barked, "get this screaming man into Trauma Bay 1. We need to explore that arm and clamp the bleeder before he goes into hypovolemic shock. Prep him for immediate surgery." "Wait, no!" the lead soldier yelled, stepping in front of the stretcher. "The corporal has a tourniquet high and tight. He's stable. I told you, the captain is the priority. He's not breathing right." "He's just concussed from the blast wave," Sterling dismissed arrogantly, not even bothering to check the captain's vitals. "Put him in Bay 3, hook him up to a monitor and give him a unit of O-negative. I will deal with him once I save this man's arm. If you soldiers interfere again, I will have security physically remove you from my hospital." From the corner of the room, standing completely still beside his supply cart, Elias Thorne watched the disaster unfold. His heart rate, which had been a steady 60 beats per minute, began a slow, rhythmic climb. His eyes locked onto the silent captain on the second litter. Elias didn't need a stethoscope to see what was happening. He saw the rapid, shallow rise and fall of the captain's chest. He saw the engorged, pulsing jugular veins on his neck. Most damning of all, Elias saw the subtle but unmistakable tracheal deviation. The man's windpipe was visibly shifting to the left. It wasn't a mere concussion, it was a massive delayed tension pneumothorax. Air was trapped in the chest cavity, crushing the captain's lungs and his heart. In less than 3 minutes, he would be dead. Suddenly, the civilian heart monitor hooked up to the captain began to shriek a high-pitched, continuous tone. The man's body violently seized, and the monitor flashed a frantic red warning. "He's crashing!" head nurse Beatrice screamed, finally realizing the severity of the situation. Sterling froze. He looked from the screaming corporal to the flatlining captain. His arrogant facade cracked in an instant, replaced by sudden, paralyzing indecision. "Charge the paddles," Sterling stammered, stepping toward the captain. "Get the defibrillator. We have to shock him." "Shocking him will stop his heart permanently, you idiot," the lead soldier roared. But the soldier didn't have the medical training to stop the crashing patient himself. Sterling grabbed the heavy defibrillator paddles, his hands visibly shaking, his mind completely blanking on the protocol for blast trauma. He was about to deliver a lethal electrical charge to a heart that was actively being crushed by internal air pressure. In the corner of the room, Elias closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The quiet life was officially over. "Archangel," he whispered to himself. Elias dropped his sterilized clipboard. The loud clatter echoed through the chaotic room like a gunshot. The clatter of Elias's heavy steel clipboard hitting the floor cut through the chaotic shouting of the trauma bay like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, the entire room seemed to freeze. Then, Elias moved. He didn't shuffle like the tired, middle-aged rookie nurse they all thought he was. He crossed the slick tile floor with the terrifying, fluid speed of an apex predator. Before Dr. Vance Sterling could press the heavy defibrillator paddles to the dying captain's chest, a hand clamped down on his wrists like a steel vise. "Clear!" Sterling screamed, trying to force the paddles down. "No," a voice rumbled. It was deep, perfectly level, and possessed a dark, heavy gravity that instantly silenced the room. Sterling blinked in shock, looking at the hand gripping his wrists, then up at Elias. The older man's winter sky eyes were devoid of the submissive warmth he usually wore. They were completely cold, dead, empty, and terrifyingly focused. With a single, precise, tactical shove, Elias forced Sterling backward. The younger, fitter doctor stumbled awkwardly, his designer scrubs snagging as he crashed hard into a rolling supply cart. "What are you doing?" Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking in sheer disbelief and outrage. "Are you insane, Thorne?" Elias didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on the captain's violently expanding neck veins and the flatlining monitor. "He is in pulseless electrical activity arrest from a massive tension pneumothorax secondary to blast overpressure," Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "You shock a crushed heart. You cook it. Put the paddles away before you kill him, Vance." The use of the chief resident's first name sent a visible shockwave through the gaggle of observing medical students. Head nurse Beatrice's jaw practically unhinged. "Beatrice," Elias barked, his tone shifting into the undeniable cadence of a battlefield commander. "I need a 14-gauge needle, 3.25 inches, betadine swab, Asherman chest seal, now." Beatrice was paralyzed, clutching a roll of gauze. You can't give orders here. You're just a floor nurse." Elias's head snapped toward her. "I said now, Beatrice, or this man's blood is on your floor." The lead soldier, who had been screaming for help moments ago, suddenly went completely still. He looked at Elias's posture. He looked at the total lack of panic in the older man's movements. He recognized that aura. It was the aura of a man who had commanded in the fires of hell. Without a word, the heavily armed soldier ripped open the crash cart, grabbed the exact needle and swabs Elias demanded, and slapped them into the nurse's waiting hand. Sterling finally regained his footing, his face flushing a violent mottled purple. "Security! Get this lunatic away from my patient! He is practicing medicine without a license! Grab him!" Elias didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on the captain's violently expanding neck veins and the flatlining monitor. "Needle decompression buys us exactly 10 minutes, Elias stated, his voice eerily calm as he checked the captain's radial pulse, his fingers pressing into the man's wrist. "We need an immediate chest tube, a definitive airway, and a massive transfusion protocol. 2 units of O-negative rapid infuser." Sterling was trembling. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was the explosive, humiliating realization that he had been completely outclassed in front of his entire staff. He pointed a violently shaking finger at Elias. "You are fired," Sterling spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You are absolutely finished, Thorne. You physically assaulted a superior, and you will go to prison for this." Elias slowly turned his head, locking eyes with the furious doctor. "You're not a superior, Vance. You're a liability." Suddenly, the heavy double doors to the bay swang open. 4 massive hospital security guards burst into the room, responding to Sterling's earlier shouts, their hands resting ominously on their stun guns. Right behind them, looking horrified, was the hospital's chief administrator. "Arrest him!" Sterling screamed, pointing triumphantly at Elias. "Restrain this lunatic right now." Elias didn't raise his hands. He just stood over his patient, calculating his next move as the guards closed in.
"Get his hands off that patient right now," Dr. Vance Sterling shrieked, practically vibrating with indignation. The 4 heavy-set security guards closed in, their stun guns unholstered, their eyes tracking Elias Thorne like he was an active shooter. The chaotic medical bay was suddenly frozen in a terrifying standoff. The terrified medical students shrank further into the corners, and head nurse Beatrice stood frozen, a bloody gauze pad still clutched in her fist. "Elias Thorne," the lead guard ordered, a burly man with a nervous twitch in his jaw. "Step away from the gurney. Hands where I can see them." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. Instead, his fingers remained firmly pressed against the captain's radial artery, tracking the fluttering, fragile pulse. The needle he had driven into the man's chest hissed softly with every shallow breath. "I have stabilized the tension pneumothorax," Elias stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the hysteria like a serrated blade. "The patient requires a definitive chest tube and a massive transfusion protocol to prevent hypovolemic shock. If I remove my hands, or if you attempt to move him without securing this line, he will die in under 4 minutes." "He's lying!" Sterling yelled, desperate to regain control of his shattered authority. "He's a glorified floor sweeper who just stabbed a patient with a massive needle. Arrest him!" The lead guard lunged forward, reaching for Elias's shoulder. Before the guard's fingers could even brush the fabric of his scrubs, Elias shifted. It wasn't a panicked flinch, it was a microscopic, terrifyingly efficient pivot of his hips. With his right hand still securing the needle in the patient's chest, Elias shot his left hand out in a blur. He caught the guard's wrist, twisted it sharply, and drove his thumb into a cluster of nerves just above the elbow. The 250-pound guard let out a sharp gasp, his entire arm going instantly limply numb. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, clutching his useless limb. The remaining 3 guards froze, completely stunned. The rookie nurse had just effortlessly neutralized their point man with one hand while simultaneously managing a critical trauma patient. "Do not touch me," Elias commanded, his tone dropping an octave, losing all warmth. The winter sky eyes were now utterly merciless. "And do not interfere with my patient." Sterling, practically hyperventilating, grabbed a sterile metal tray and threw it across the room in a blind rage. It crashed violently against the wall. "You psychotic old man, I am the chief resident. I command this room. You are fired. You hear me? Fired." "Dr. Sterling, control yourself." The new voice belonged to Dr. Elias Thorne, the hospital's chief administrator, who had rushed into the bay right behind security. He was an older man, sharp and politically minded, staring at the chaotic scene with absolute horror. "What in God's name is happening here, Vance?" the administrator demanded, pointing at the bloody chest decompression. "This man," Sterling screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at Elias, "assaulted me, assaulted security, and performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a critical patient. Have him arrested immediately." Before the administrator could process the madness, the heavy mechanical doors of the trauma bay violently blew open for a second time. The commotion had drawn more than just hospital security. 3 more heavily armed soldiers pushed their way in, shoving past the terrified medical students. Leading them was a man whose presence immediately suffocated the room. He wore no tactical gear, only a sharply pressed Class A uniform, the shoulders heavy with the stars of a two-star general. His face was weathered leather, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. General Marcus Vance, the man in charge of the entire classified operation that had gone horribly wrong. "What the hell is the delay?" General Vance roared, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "Why is my extraction team in a civilian triage bay instead of an operating room?" Dr. Sterling instantly straightened up, his arrogant posture returning like a reflex. He saw an opportunity to salvage his reputation by appealing to authority. He confidently strode toward the general. "General, sir, I am Dr. Vance Sterling, chief resident. Your men brought a critically wounded officer into my ER. I was attempting to stabilize a secondary casualty when this rogue nurse," Sterling pointed aggressively at Elias, "interfered. He assaulted me and performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on your captain. He is actively endangering your man." General Vance's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. He looked past the pompous doctor, past the terrified head nurse, and locked on the man standing perfectly still beside the bloody gurney. The general's gaze fell upon the older, unassuming nurse in light blue scrubs. He saw the steady, unflinching posture. He saw the precise placement of the chest decompression needle. "You," General Vance whispered, his booming voice dropping to a harsh, bewildered rasp. The older man didn't look up. He simply reached for the heavy, encrypted trauma radio clipped to the soldier's vest on the gurney, the one that had been silent since they arrived. He picked up the heavy black mic and keyed it, his thumb pressing the talk button 3 deliberate times. Click, click, click. The sound of the dead radio mic was barely audible over the chaotic shrieking of the trauma bay's monitors. But to General Marcus Vance, it was louder than an artillery shell. 3 deliberate, evenly spaced clicks on a secure, encrypted JSOC frequency. It was the universal Tier 1 signal for medic on station, situation under control. It was a signal that hadn't been used in that specific rhythmic cadence since a disastrous, highly classified extraction in the Karengal Valley almost a decade ago. General Vance stopped dead in his tracks. The furious, authoritative red flush drained instantly from his weathered face, replaced by an ashen, ghost-seeing pallor. "What?" General Vance stammered, the word barely a whisper escaping his lips. Dr. Vance Sterling, completely misreading the general's stunned silence, stepped forward with a triumphant, spiteful smirk. "Exactly, General. The man is clearly unhinged. Now he's playing with your soldiers' communications gear. Security, I ordered you to get him out of here." "Shut your mouth," General Vance snapped. It wasn't a yell, it was a low, terrifying growl that made the chief resident physically recoil. The general's wide eyes never left Elias. Elias didn't acknowledge the general. His sole focus remained on the bleeding man beneath his hands. The needle decompression had bought the captain precious minutes, but the monitor showed his blood pressure was still catastrophically low. He was bleeding out internally from the blast wave. "Need 2 units of O- on the rapid infuser, right now," Elias commanded, his voice devoid of panic but heavy with absolute command. When head nurse Beatrice remained frozen in shock, Elias's voice cracked like a whip. "Move, Beatrice, or he dies on your watch." But it wasn't Beatrice who moved. It was the lead special ops soldier. Conditioned by years of brutal warfare to instinctively obey that specific commanding voice of office, the massive operator shoved the terrified nurse aside. He ripped open the blood cooler, grabbed 2 frozen bags of O- and practically threw them to Elias. Elias caught them flawlessly with one hand. As he reached aggressively across the gurney to spike the IV lines, the violent motion caused the cheap fabric of his light blue scrub top to snag on the cart. The collar tore, slipping down to expose his left shoulder and chest. Beneath the sterile hospital fabric was a massive, jagged burn scar that spiraled brutally around his collarbone, the unmistakable, horrific remnant of a white phosphorus blast. But it wasn't just the scar that made the room freeze. Nestled perfectly within the ruined, scarred tissue was a faded black ink tattoo, a winged sword piercing a medical cross wrapped in a crown of barbed wire. It was the insignia of the Night Stalker's most elite, classified trauma unit, a shadow unit that officially did not exist, a unit that had only one surviving master medic on its roster. The lead soldier saw the tattoo. He stopped breathing. His hands hovered over the gurney, shaking. He looked from the faded ink to the older man's cold winter sky eyes. "No way," the soldier breathed, instinctively taking a half step back in pure, unadulterated reverence. Elias ignored the awe. He fluidly spiked the blood bags and opened the lines wide. "Squeeze the bags," Elias ordered the stunned soldier, his eyes locked on the monitor. "Keep the pressure high. Push it into him, now." The soldier snapped instantly out of his daze, gripping the blood bags and squeezing them with white-knuckled intensity. "Yes, sir," he barked, the respectful title slipping out automatically. Dr. Sterling was losing his mind. His pristine ER had been completely hijacked by a glorified janitor and a squad of grunts. "General!" Dr. Sterling yelled, stepping right into the general's line of sight, his ego refusing to accept defeat. "If you open your mouth one more time, Doctor," General Vance whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent, "I will have my men forcefully remove you from this building and charge you with interfering in a classified military operation. Do you understand me?" Sterling nodded frantically, his eyes wide with absolute terror, squeaking out a pathetic noise as the general dropped him back to the floor in a heap. On the gurney, the heart monitor began to beep with a stronger, steadier rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. The massive influx of blood and the relieved pressure on the lungs had worked exactly as intended. The captain's pale face began to regain a fraction of its color. The impossible, fatal situation was completely stabilized. The miracle was complete. Elias finally stepped back, wiping a smear of the captain's blood from his bare, scarred shoulder. He calmly pulled his torn scrub top back into place, hiding the winged sword once more. He looked up, his expression completely unreadable, and finally met General Vance's unwavering stare. The entire trauma bay held its breath. The security guards were frozen. The medical students were dead silent. Sterling was trembling on the floor. General Vance slowly bypassed the gurney. He walked right past the multi-million-dollar medical equipment, right past the terrified hospital administrator, and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of the quiet, older rookie nurse. The absolute silence in Trauma Bay 1 was suffocating, broken only by the steady, life-affirming beep of the captain's heart monitor. General Marcus Vance stood exactly 2 feet away from the unassuming man in the light blue, blood-stained scrubs. Dr. Vance Sterling, still entirely oblivious to the gravity of the moment, scrambled up from the floor, his face flushed with panicked indignation. "General, I demand you listen to me. This man is a junior floor nurse. He is a janitor with a stethoscope. He has no surgical clearance." General Vance didn't even turn his head. He simply raised one weathered hand, silencing the arrogant doctor instantly. His sharp eyes remained locked on Elias. He took in the older man's calm posture, the faded winged sword tattoo partially hidden beneath the torn scrub top, and the absolute lack of fear in those winter sky eyes. Slowly, deliberately, the 2-star general straightened his posture. He brought his right hand up in a razor-sharp textbook military salute. "Master Chief Thorne," General Vance's booming voice echoed off the sterile walls, thick with an overwhelming, undeniable reverence. "It has been 5 years. It is a profound honor to see you again, Archangel." The words hit the room like a localized earthquake. Instantly, without a single spoken command, the 4 heavily armed special ops soldiers in the room snapped to attention. Their boots slammed together on the hospital tile in perfect echoing unison. They raised their hands, saluting the quiet floor nurse with a synchronized precision that sent shivers down the spines of the terrified medical students.
Dr. Sterling's jaw practically detached from his face. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his eyes darted frantically between the saluting general, the rigid soldiers, and the man he had spent the last 6 months relentlessly bullying. Master Chief?" Sterling stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Archangel? What is this? He's a nobody." General Vance finally broke his salute and slowly turned his terrifying gaze upon the trembling chief resident. The disgust in the general's eyes was absolute. "A nobody?" General Vance repeated, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Dr. Sterling, the man you just called a glorified janitor, is Master Chief Elias Thorne. He is the most highly decorated Tier 1 combat medic in the history of Joint Special Operations Command. He has 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, and he has saved more lives under enemy fire than you will ever treat in your pristine, air-conditioned civilian career." Head nurse Beatrice let out a sharp, horrified gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She had threatened to transfer a living military legend to the geriatric ward. The 4 security guards, realizing exactly who they had almost tackled, quietly and rapidly holstered their weapons, backing away until they hit the wall. "When my men requested a trauma surgeon," General Vance continued, stepping mercilessly toward Sterling, who shrank back until he bumped into a supply cart. "When my men requested a trauma surgeon, they hoped for competence. Instead, they got an arrogant, textbook-blind amateur who nearly cooked my captain's heart with a defibrillator because he couldn't diagnose a basic blast wave pneumothorax. Master Chief Thorne didn't interfere, Doctor. He intervened to stop you from committing negligent manslaughter." Sterling opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. His ego, his career, his entire untouchable God complex had just been publicly, surgically dismantled in front of his staff, his students, and the hospital administrator. Suddenly, a raspy, painful cough echoed from the gurney. The room turned to see the VIP captain slowly opening his eyes. His gaze was hazy, fighting through the haze of blood loss and shock, but as his vision cleared, he focused on the man standing over his left shoulder. A weak, trembling smile touched the wounded officer's pale lips. "Archangel," the captain whispered, his voice incredibly weak but filled with absolute awe. They told me you retired." Elias's hard, blank expression finally softened. He reached out, resting a gentle, steadying hand on the captain's uninjured shoulder. "I did, Cap, but it seems I still can't leave you kids alone for 5 minutes without you getting into trouble." The captain let out a breathless chuckle before wincing in pain. "Glad you were here, sir." Elias finally turned away from the gurney. He looked at the terrified head nurse Beatrice, then at the completely broken Dr. Sterling. He didn't gloat, he didn't shout, he simply picked up his heavy steel clipboard from the floor, wiped a drop of blood from the metal clip, and handed it to Dr. Sterling's favorite wide-eyed medical student. "The patient is stabilized and ready for the OR, Elias said, his voice returning to his quiet, unassuming rumble. He looked back at General Vance. "General, if your men will assist, we will transport the captain to Surgery Bay 4. I will personally brief the attending." "Lead the way, Master Chief," the general ordered, stepping aside respectfully. As the Special Ops team expertly grabbed the gurney and followed Elias Thorne out of the chaotic trauma bay, Dr. Vance Sterling was left standing in the center of the room. He was surrounded by the deafening silence of his ruined reputation, finally understanding that true power doesn't need to shout. It just does what needs to be done.